going to look at California 2006, a little bit into 2007. And one of the interesting things as I was thinking about this is how different what we're going to talk about is today than when we first started talking about this several months ago, and a little bit how different it is than it would have been 2 weeks ago. It's a constantly changing landscape, which is very exciting and nerve-wracking for those of us who work in the movement right now, but there's a great deal going on. And before I go to the panelists, I just want to sort of give a very brief overview of a few things. California is really seeing a transformation when it comes to the rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people over the last 6 or 7 years. Back in 1999, LGBT Californians weren't covered in our Fair Employment and Housing Act. Couples in long-term relationships were legal strangers. There was no such thing as a statewide domestic partnership registry. We didn't have safe schools legislation. And we had, well, a few court victories. We didn't have a lot of progress. Over the last 6 years, we've seen truly a remarkable change in all of that. There have been well over a dozen bills to provide some of the most sweeping rights for LGBT people in the country, passed by the legislature and signed into law by both Democratic Governor Gray Davis and Republican Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, with some exceptions, which we will talk about. We have seen incredible victories in the court, and we've seen for the first time a ballot measure that would amend the Constitution to restrict marriage equality fail to get the necessary signatures to qualify. That doesn't mean it's still not a threat. It just means, for the first time, one deadline went, and they failed to do what they needed to do. Among the things as we're looking at 2006, both in marriage equality and broader equality issues, are a continuing court case that we're going to discuss. Continuing legislative work. Today's the last day for bills to be introduced in the California legislature. There are 8 LGBT civil rights bills that by the end of the day will be introduced in the legislature. Marriage equality bill is not one of them. It doesn't mean a bill won't happen after the deadline, because that happens all the time in California. It just means it hasn't happened by today. And if not, in 2007, when we have a new legislature and a possibility of a new governor, the bill would be coming back. And we have elections in California that are very relevant. Regardless of whether there's a constitutional amendment in November, we have 32 of the 62 legislators who voted for the marriage equality bill are not running for re-election to their present seats, meaning we could be looking at a very different world, better or worse on these issues, depending on how you look at them, in 2007 than we are today. And we have a great panel of people to talk about it. Pacey Markman, who's the furthest away, who's principal at Zimmerman & Markman, who is the consultant for both the Equality for All, which is the ballot measure committee to defeat any ballot measure, and the Equality Project, which is an educational project on marriage equality being housed by the Equality California Institute. Patrick Guerrero, who is the president of Log Cabin Republicans, Courtney Jocelyn with the National Center for Lesbian Rights, and Alexander Robinson with the National Black Justice Coalition. So what I'd like to do is start with Pacey to talk a little bit about the landscape on the ballot measures, the constitutional amendments, and how those are going. And then we're going to work around the panel and also just have a little more give and take, since everyone here is sort of involved with every one of these different components, because they're all pretty woven tightly together. So Pacey, why don't you start?
Okay, so good. As Jeff alluded to, it's unlikely but not impossible that we'll have a ballot initiative on marriage this year. Should I stop? I mean, that's it. That's really an amazing piece of news. There's a slight chance the other side theoretically has until April the 20th to file 1 million signatures, but we don't see any evidence. It's possible that there's some Foursquare church out in Barstow with tunnels underneath where they're marching in the pod people to sign these petitions, but our heat-seeking helicopters have picked up no activity of that sort. This is amazing because it's very rare for us to have stopped these people, and I think we can take credit for stopping them. Let me just give you a bit of the landscape in 2005. There are two things that are really different about this situation from other ballot initiative fights that I've been involved in. I worked on the No on 6 campaign in 1978, the first statewide ballot initiative that would have limited gay rights, and I did No on 9 in Oregon in 1992, and a couple of others, and this was the first time where we were as ready as we were, and that made a huge difference. And we can take credit for that. What we can't take credit for, but which we can all applaud, is that they were disorganized. Normally, the other side is incredibly, robotic and marching in lockstep. But this time, there were two competing groups that were pouring ballot initiatives into the Attorney General's office. One was led by Pete Knight's widow. For those of you who don't know, Pete Knight was the instigator of Prop 22 back in 2000 that limited marriage rights in the state. And the other side, and that group is associated with pretty much everyone on the right, led by James Dobson from the Focus on the Family. And they filed a bunch of initiatives. And then there's a group that's a little newer to the game, run by a guy named Randy Thomason, and he's only vaguely associated with Lou Sheldon from the traditional, I love these names, the Traditional Values Coalition, and he's part of the gambling, they both are, the gambling mess that Jack Abramoff has gotten them into, but enough about that. Anyhow, these groups filed a whole bunch of ballot initiatives that would have limited marriage and would have taken away existing domestic partnership rights. Now, they didn't write them that way. They didn't want us to know that that was what they were doing, and I think they really thought they'd get in under the radar. And Courtney will talk a little bit about what I think is the single great advance in this year, and that is that we were able to stop them from having a ballot designation that just said stops gay marriage. They fought a terrific fight with the Attorney General and then in the courts to ensure that the truth about the initiatives would appear on the petitions for signatures, and that was that it would stop gay marriage, same-sex marriage, and would eliminate domestic partnership rights. And once that happened, we think, I don't want to tell you that I can get into the head of these people. I don't want to imply that there's any intelligent design to what's going on their side. I really don't know about that. But I suspect that as those ballot designations came down, saying that it would have banned same-sex marriage and dismantled domestic partnership rights, they had to see in their polling what we were seeing, which was that we would win and that they would lose. And I suspect the people who would normally fund them chose not to. Part of our being ready, we were hired in September, and by September there was this huge statewide coalition that involved every single gay and lesbian organization. We had already begun to build a Latino coalition, Asian American coalition, African American coalitions to develop messages that would speak directly to those communities. We had brought labor into our coalition, and it exhibited a much better ability to raise money than they had, which was really unusual for us. We were usually playing catch-up in these matters. So, as Jeff said, they missed the deadline for filing signatures to get on the June ballot, and now they're 40 days away from missing the deadline to file signatures for November, and they've said that they're not looking towards November, they're looking to 2008, which is good and bad news, because it means they're not going away. I mean, it's like pests in the kitchen. You use the raid, and then one day you come in the morning and you turn the lights on and they're back. And I just have that feeling about these people. In any case, we can take the lessons that we've learned from this year and carry them forward. One of the things that we're doing is we're keeping in place this coalition. We're keeping in place this fundraising mechanism so that we're ready for them in 2008, whatever they come at us with. And what they may come at us with, because between now and 2008, though there are a lot of variables, we may have a marriage law signed by a Democratic governor. We may have a court case that helps us, which will be very good for us on the one hand, but it will also roil the waters and encourage the other side to come at us. And if they came at us in 2008 with a marriage-only initiative, we'd have a tough job. So I see now our job over the next 2 years is to do something we've never done before, which is to educate people from using television commercials down to knocking on doors on marriage itself and why same-sex marriage is a good thing. And that's, Jeff alluded to that as well, and that's a project we're working on with the Equality California Institute, so that as we've seen the numbers on domestic partnership approval, the public approves of domestic partnership by 60 or 70% in the state. It's incredible. That's an incredibly high number. Marriage, of course, is much below that. We've seen some movement on marriage, and our job over the next 2 years, it seems to me, assuming there is no November initiative, is to raise the number of the public support for marriage in and of itself, so we can be in a really good position to withstand whatever they come at us with in 2008.
Great. Thank you, Pacey. I just want to go, before we go to Courtney, we're going to talk about the litigation, both the affirmative marriage litigation that's going on right now, some very wonderful successes that recently happened at the California Supreme Court on parenting rights, and also the success on the ballot measure fight. And just to put that one in a little bit of context for folks who aren't as engaged every day in the political process as some of us, is the proponents of a ballot measure or constitutional amendment that's going to be an initiative ballot measure put forward their measure. And the Attorney General comes up with a title and summary. If the proponents don't like it, they can sue, which is what happened here. And there was intervention by our side, with NCLR serving as one of our counsel in that case, to argue and support what the Attorney General had written, which were titles such as Elimination of Domestic Partnership Rights, Marriage, to focus on really the main thing they did, which was eliminate rights that already existed, that people already had, which is different than any of the other measures we've seen around the country. And that victory in the courts, I agree with Pacey, had a huge impact on their ability to move forward. We do know that if they don't qualify this November and they resubmit measures for 2008, we will have a different Attorney General, one of the impacts of term limits. It could be one of several people, and we could see very different language. So it's one of these situations where litigation will most likely happen again, and we just don't know where we're going to end up. So Courtney, if maybe you can cover a little bit about that litigation, and then the other litigation happening in California, and where you see it going.
Right. So, as Pacey and Jeff have indicated, what the right wing wanted to do here was to hide what they were actually doing with their ballot initiative, and to try to focus the language from the Attorney General's office solely on marriage, and to not talk at all about the fact that it would remove existing rights and protections for registered domestic partners. But fortunately, the Attorney General's language was really clear, and not only did the title itself make clear that it would eliminate domestic partnership rights, but it was really clear, and it actually gave people examples. What does this actually mean? How will this impact actual people? And the title and summary from the Attorney General's office said explicitly that it would void and make unenforceable certain rights and responsibilities, including community property, intestate succession, adoption, custody, hospital visitation, healthcare decisions. And when people read that, when they have specifics and when they know that what they're going to vote on means that someone is not going to be able to visit their partner in the hospital on their deathbed, they understand and they know that that's not actually what they want to do, even if they don't support the right to marry for same-sex couples. So it was incredibly important to get that very clear language in the Attorney General's title and summary, and it was tremendous to have the court, properly of course, to say that that is what the effect of that ballot initiative would have been. and I think was part of why they were unable to get support for their ballot initiative. And then just to take a few moments to kind of update people about where our affirmative marriage litigation is here in the state of California. And I'll give a little bit of background because there was a lot of stuff happening here in the past 2 years, and the trajectory of it is a little bit confusing. As I think everyone here knows, just about 2 years ago, on February 12, 2004, San Francisco Mayor Gavin Newsom began marrying same-sex couples in San Francisco. And for the next month, over 4,000 couples, same-sex couples, were married in California until on March 11, 2004, the California Supreme Court ordered them to stop on the day that they decided that they would hear the litigation about whether San Francisco had the authority to do what it was doing. But when the court decided to take that case about the mayor's authority, it made clear that it was not addressing the question of whether excluding same-sex couples from marriage violates the California Constitution, and it was limiting itself just to the question of the authority. So we took the court at its word, and bright and early the next morning, we filed an affirmative marriage litigation case in San Francisco on behalf of 12 same-sex couples and Equality California, our statewide organization, and a family group, our Family Coalition, seeking the right to marry for same-sex couples, arguing that it violates the California Constitution by infringing the right to marry, discriminating on the basis of sex and sexual orientation, and infringing freedom of expression and association. And one of the things that I think is interesting about the California litigation that makes it a little bit different than what's going on in other parts of the country is the protections that we currently have for same-sex couples here in California. And the fact that at the time that lawsuit was filed, California had already declared that same-sex couples were going to be granted the same rights and protections and obligations of married couples under state law, meant that a lot of arguments that other states are putting forth in their marriage cases are just off the table here. And so, right off the bat, the California Attorney General said, as it had to, that it was not putting forward any arguments that the justifications for marriage are related to the protection or well-being of children, because it just simply is inconsistent with the public policy of this state, which is that lesbian and gay people are good parents and they have the same rights with regard to children born to their relationship. And so here in California, actually, there are only 2 arguments being put forward by the state about why they should be able to continue to discriminate. And those 2 arguments are that the court should defer to the common understanding of marriage, and that the court should defer to the legislative process. And along with the Wu versus Lockyer case, which is our case, there's 5 other cases related to same-sex couples marrying that were coordinated in San Francisco. And on April 13th of last year, Judge Richard Kramer in San Francisco ruled in favor of the couples in all 6 cases, rejecting both of the state's arguments and saying that, in fact, they didn't even pass under the rational basis test, much less strict scrutiny. And actually, the state's arguments have even less, there's even less to support them now than there was when they asserted them 2 years ago. Since the case was originally filed, we now have both houses of the California legislature voting in favor of marriage equality and saying that excluding same-sex couples from the right to marry violates the California Constitution. And in fact, actually, in the findings of AB 849, the legislature specifically said that excluding same-sex couples from the right to marry discriminates by infringing the right to marry and discriminating on the basis of sex and sexual orientation. So, in fact, saying that we should defer to the legislative process makes really no sense here in the state of California, because deferring to what the legislature has said would mean that we should allow same-sex couples to marry. And we have also seen some other developments in the courts about same-sex couples. As Jeff mentioned, this past summer we had 3 tremendous victories in the California Supreme Court with regard to children born to same-sex couples, where the California Supreme Court became the first Supreme Court in the country to hold that when a lesbian or gay couple, or lesbian, I guess, couple has a child through assisted reproduction, that automatically, whether they are registered or not, that both of them are automatically automatically the legal parents of children born to that couple. And in the decision, at 3 points actually in the decision, the court said there simply is no reason that a child cannot have two parents of the same sex. And really, goes further undercutting any type of argument that marriage is related, that excluding same-sex couples from the right to marry somehow furthers the interests of children. And I thought I would just end by sort of bringing us up to date about where those 6 cases are. So Judge Kramer's decision was in April of 2005, and all the cases are now on appeal in the Court of Appeal in San Francisco. Briefing is now complete. The last briefs were filed on February 10th of this year, and we are awaiting an oral argument date. And the one thing I just wanted to add, and it's sort of related to what Pacey was saying, is the marriage litigation has really been able to draw upon the incredible work that has been done in this state to really do a tremendous amount of education and building support for the right to marry for same-sex couples. And we really saw this on January 9th of this year when the amicus briefs were filed in the marriage cases. And on that day, more than 250 civil rights and religious groups filed briefs on behalf of the couples seeking the right to marry for lesbian and gay couples. And it was just an incredible array of organizations, including the NAACP, MALDEF. There were more than 200 religious organizations and faith leaders that filed in support of marriage equality. And it's just a testament to the just tremendous work that Equality California has done and the campaign. And I think it bodes well for the future, and I don't think it will be lost on the court that this really tremendous array of people support the right to marry for same-sex couples.
And just as you're looking at the timing for a decision at the appellate level and at the Supreme Court level, just comment on that a little bit. And also, there's obviously been a shift in the makeup of the California Supreme Court. A lot of people who might support marriage equality opposed someone who happened to leave the court going to the federal bench, but now people think that might be a good thing for the fight here. So can you just, to the extent you can comment on that,
right,
and just the timing of when you think we might have a final decision.
Right. So as I said, the briefing is now complete in the Court of Appeals, and we anticipate that oral argument will happen sometime in the spring or summer of this year, and the Court of Appeal usually does issue opinions within 90 days of hearing the case. So it could mean that we'll have a decision in the fall of 2006, but there's no telling. The court could sit on it actually for quite a while before scheduling oral argument. They have not yet set a date for oral argument. Obviously, there will be an appeal, and we all anticipate that the California Supreme Court will grant review and hear the case. And it's really hard to predict. The court sometimes goes very, very quickly. The parenting cases were accepted and decided in less than a year. Other cases actually have sat before that court for a number of years, and it obviously depends on how divided the court is and how quickly they can come to a decision. So it's a little bit hard to predict when that will all finish up. And actually, the change in the makeup of the court is sort of interesting because the justice that is now on the Supreme Court taking Justice Brown's position actually was on our panel, our Court of Appeal panel, in a prior appeal related to the marriage cases. So she would probably actually have been on our Court of Appeal panel and will now be on the Supreme Court. And I mean, I think at bottom, we just feel very optimistic about the case. We think that we have a very, very strong case, that the California Supreme Court has ruled on a number of lesbian and gay issues in the past couple of years, and we have succeeded in all those cases. And I think one of the things that's particularly relevant to this case, even though no one's relying on the welfare of children here, the court has always been incredibly cognizant of children and the needs of children and the needs to protect children and to provide them with equal protection. And I think that bodes well for this case.
Great. As this issue moves forward, we have voters, legislators, judges, all who come from different backgrounds and all who represent different constituencies. And so we're going to talk to Alexander and have him talk a little bit about some of the outreach work that's been going on, particularly in the African American community, but also to note that in the legislature this year, if we look at the California Legislative API Caucus, Latino Caucus, and Black Caucus, they all voted in larger percentages in support of the bill than any of the Caucasian legislators, if you take them as a group. So we had more support among the leadership. And in this year, we saw the NAACP California Conference become the first chapter of the NAACP to affirmatively support marriage equality, and we saw the United Farm Workers come on board. So we've seen incredible progress. We've seen poll numbers in all those communities really moving in the direction. I think it's thanks to a lot of the work your organization does. So if you can talk a little bit about how we do that and how you see that fitting in the picture.
Thanks. Well, I think that we have had a great deal of success with the leadership, and I think pretty consistently, not only here in California, but throughout the country. If you look at the black caucuses of most of the state legislatures or at the federal level, they have historically been more supportive, more cognizant of the connections of discrimination and supportive of the rights of gays and lesbians. I think that it was very significant that the NAACP here in California came on board, but that did not happen without an extraordinary amount of work behind the scenes, some very committed folks who had been allies and partners for a long time, but it still remains a contentious issue within the organization, which is sort of my second point, which is where I feel we face a challenge. We have the leadership of many of the organizations on our side, many of the organizations who have not yet come out in full support of marriage equality. If you have the private conversations with the members of their leadership, they are often with us and supportive. It is their constituencies that are not. It is, and that lack of support often is motivated sometimes by fear, because one of the things that happened, for example, here in California with the NAACP's endorsement of the marriage bill was organizing among African American ministers to protest, to ask people to withdraw their membership. I think that we, along with others, were successful in sort of mobilizing a counterattack, replacing some of those members. But those are efforts that we have to continue to undertake. I think a second step that we've been pursuing is actually working with African American ministers on this issue. It is extraordinarily challenging to get them to make a distinction of civil marriage and the rights in the church, and that is something that we continue to have dialogue with them about. What is fascinating and inconsistent often about the position that you will find if you sort of talk to about the issues to the sort of average African American person in the community, is that despite their feelings against homosexuality, despite their belief in that the Bible condemns homosexuality, they have an aversion to any form of discrimination. And so if we're talking about issues of employment, issues of housing, all of those places, we can maintain their support. When we get to marriage, there's a distinction. The eliminating folks from marriage is not a sort of a clear point for them. And I believe here in California, there's an additional challenge, which is that there is this notion that, in fact, the protections that are available are sufficient, and that heterosexual marriage is different, and it's okay for it to be different. That's a distinction that should be that we should not that we should not object to. We continue to make the argument that this is setting up a sort of separate system, and that separate but equal is not something that we've experienced. That we know that that's not appropriate. Again, I think that we have been able to successfully make that argument with leadership, with lawyers, with the individuals who work on civil rights, who sort of understand the way in which the law also has an impact on society and culture. But we've not had as sort of much success in moving the individuals at sort of at the retail level, if you will. And I think that I see the possibility of not having a ballot initiative this year as an extraordinarily reprieve, because I don't believe we were anywhere near close to ready. I think that, in fact, despite all of the successes that we have had in really building probably one of the most diverse campaigns that has been built in any state, exists here in California, yet it was not as deep as it needed to be. Organizations were engaged, but at the top level and not throughout the organization. And so that is now our challenge, to engage not just the presidents and the vice presidents, but the secretaries and the membership of the various organizations to empower our supportive clergy and pastors to speak up and to be more active. We will be undertaking a series of meetings throughout the state, specifically with the members of African American clergy, in an effort to, in the one instance, have sort of private discussions with them about how, those that support us, about how they move in their positions. With the very real understanding their reality, that it might mean that they will lose members of their churches, because that's what the experience has been for those who have taken the right position. Our efforts are to strategically work with them to help them build up their own sort of courage around this issue, but also to deal with strategies to help them develop strategies to deal with the conflicts that might exist within with their constituencies. I would say that the final point that's important here in California is really the infrastructure, or the lack of infrastructure, that exists among African American gay and lesbian organizations and organizing. There is a fairly well organized social structure here in the state, but there is not the sort of political active infrastructure throughout the state. And so part of our efforts also will be focused on changing that dynamic and moving some of these socially active groups that have primarily been there to provide sort of social support and building self-esteem and awareness among African American gay and lesbian individuals, to move them toward more political activism, both at the level of sort of individually being supportive of issues, but also of being able to be engaged in the kind of sort of door-to-door educational campaigns, telephone campaigns, fundraising efforts that will be necessary if and when a ballot initiative does appear.
Great. Thank you, Alexander. Patrick, in a way, you have an opposite situation in California. California Republican voters, 62% support either marriage or domestic partnership / civil unions. Vast majority support domestic partnership civil unions, but it's over half support giving all the rights to same-sex couples. Yet, virtually every Republican in a leadership position, elected leaders, have signed a pledge that they not only oppose marriage but want to repeal domestic partnership, with the exception really being the governor, who has signed some pretty groundbreaking LGBT rights bills we haven't seen anywhere in the country, including legislation that ends discrimination against transgender people in healthcare. So we've seen a lot of progress with him. We've also seen a veto of the marriage bill. But even with the progress of him, we see the legislator, the elected Republicans, not being supportive as their constituents. So how do we, and how do you, work to build that bridge and increase support both in the leadership and on the ground?
Sure. I hail from Massachusetts, and we've experienced marriage equality for the last year, and it's cost me so much damn money buying wedding gifts for my friends that I wonder why you're rushing to marriage here in California, when 20 of your best friends get married in the same year, it's a tough hit on your wallet. So beware when you're finally successful.
Move to Texas.
Move to-
No problem.
Well said. On the four battlegrounds of marriage equality, the legal battleground, the public opinion field, the ballot box, and in dealing with political leadership, you might imagine that I wear certain colored glasses, red-colored glasses, taking a Republican perspective on each of those fronts. And I'm actually more optimistic and more hopeful than some of you might feel when you hear the word Republican in the context of my title. On the legal front, I think it's really important to note that the legal arguments being made so successfully by the legal community are truly conservative legal arguments. And when you look at some of the major decisions that we have experienced and celebrated over the course of the last couple of years, what's remarkable about them, and is rarely noted, is that Republican jurists often wrote those decisions. 6 out of 7 of the justices writing the historic, voting on the historic Goodrich decision were Republican appointees. And when you read that decision, as I assume some of you have, I find it to be a very conservative, traditional, family and value-oriented document. Courtney mentioned Judge Kramer, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that he's a Catholic Republican appointee of Pete Wilson. And of course, all of this in the wake of the Lawrence decision, which you're talking about in a bit, where 4 out of the 6 justices on the court were Republican appointees, and Anthony Kennedy wrote it. And I say that not to brag as a Republican, because I'm embarrassed by attempts to amend the federal Constitution. I'm embarrassed by the fact that the Republican Party in this state, which could be found in a phone booth, as a result of its divisive political rhetoric over the last several years, has been on the wrong side of this issue too often. But I'm actually hopeful because of smart legal arguments, and because what we're really talking about here are conservative family values that we can all embrace, whether we're Democrats or Republicans, that we can win on the legal battleground and do it in a way that works and works for the public. An activist judge in America today is a judge that the far right disagrees with. It has been Republican activist judges who've made the strongest cases in many places in America for marriage, and I think that is a hopeful sign of where we're heading. The second battleground, obviously, is public opinion and messaging. One of the things that I think made Equality California's work so successful in the past year is a willingness to talk not only about the rights that we want that we don't have because of discrimination in marriage, but to focus on the responsibilities and obligations that we are willing to accept as tax-paying, law-abiding citizens of a state. We haven't done a good job, I think, in the past of doing that. And we have allowed the lexicon of family values and faith to be stolen by groups with names like Pacey had mentioned earlier. And I think we need to reclaim some of that stuff and do it boldly and be willing to talk to people who may not agree with us today. And as we know, about 1/3 of people in California automatically support us when it comes to almost all of our issues. About 1/3, maybe a little less, disagree with us and will until their unfortunate passing. And then another 1/3 is fair-minded, want to be with us, and we need to give them the tools and the education and the experience to understand why this really matters for our families. When it comes to the ballot box, you've had enough experience here in California with ballot initiatives. And what we know from the experience in other states and also here is that we cannot win a ballot measure, whether it be in 2006 or 2007 or 2008 or whenever, if we don't do better work with conservative Democrats, with Republicans, with people of faith, with Latinos, and with African Americans. And as a movement that has focused in a progressive tradition on the rights we didn't have, that shift of lexicon and that willingness to talk to people in a new language, to me, is critical. We won't win an anti-gay ballot question. We won't defeat it if we don't have better numbers in Orange County and San Diego County and the places where we lose too big in past elections. The fourth piece is our political leadership. And let's all face it in this room, there is at least a 50-50 chance that Governor Schwarzenegger will be reelected as governor, and a 50-50 chance that he may not. Jeff was generous to note that he had the governor had a 100% rating, according to Equality California, until the marriage measure hit his desk. So I actually think we have a governor who hasn't embraced the extreme right, whose veto message, and trust me, I was disappointed in that veto message, gave some indications of where there might be wiggle room with this governor. He's given us a path to talk about how we might sign it. A little bit odd, I might be honest, to reflect, that if the courts do something and or if the people change their minds based on a ballot question, he would sign it. But those are certainly ways to get this governor to sign it. And maybe most importantly, having a Republican governor oppose an anti-gay marriage ballot initiative, to me, is a very critical piece to winning. Whether it's this year or if he's elected, his opposition, and in particular a Republican governor's opposition to that type of measure, I think could be one of the tipping points that helps us historically win. I'll close by noting that my organization was founded because of the Briggs Initiative. It was a group of very courageous, very quiet, very discreet, and not out gay and lesbian conservatives who were frightened by the Briggs Initiatives, many of them teachers and Republicans at the time. And they were part of several groups of people that reached out to Ronald Reagan and got Ronald Reagan at that time to come out against the question that looked like it was going to pass. And our commitment is to go back to that tradition as an organization. And as a result of that, we opened up our first ever satellite office in Sacramento, knowing that one of the biggest battlefields in America over the next 2 to 4 years is here in California. And if we can win here, and if we can hold marriage equality in Massachusetts, we can make a case in every state in between. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Patrick. And it is good to note, although every Democrat running for statewide office, governor, lieutenant governor, supports marriage equality, Governor Schwarzenegger's position is the same as our 2 Democratic senators. So we still have some ways to go in both parties in the leadership on this issue here in California. Just want to see if any of the panelists want to comment on anything that any other panelists has said. Otherwise, we'll open it up to some questions.
I just want to comment on Patrick's observation about the sort of the language that we use in the message and sort of the conservative message around marriage, which I think also works with many African American communities. In part because our opponents have often framed gay and lesbians' pursuit of our rights and equality as somehow pitting us against African Americans and the gains that African Americans have made in the civil rights arena, and or that our winning our rights would somehow diminish their rights, or that we are all wealthy and have lots of resources, and this is just yet another power grab. I think talking about marriage in the context of commitment, responsibility, relationships, willingness to care for another individual, love, all of those things that most folks think about when they think about marriage is really one key way to win over a certain segment of individuals who have not really fully decided against us. And so I would second the notion that really having that, sort of the conservative message would be something that would be really worthwhile for us to pursue.
I would also like to comment on, I had a debate outside with someone, but there's not full consensus on our kind of movement's focus on marriage equality. There are some people who say, why have you kind of rushed this? Why are you making this the kind of battleground of debate? Is that fair to do to people who aren't with you yet? And I just wanted to make a case that I couldn't disagree more with that assessment. I'm convinced that the powerful stories of our families demanding an end to discrimination in marriage was a very smart political and legal move that was well timed. If we had decided to have a movement battleground on domestic partnership, we'd be having a discussion about reciprocal rights and contract law. What we did was we negotiated hard for full and absolute equality. And it has led to, in the state of California, 2 out of 3 Republicans supporting civil unions or marriage equality. Had we started somewhere else, and if we had taken that discussion across the country, I don't think you'd see most Americans, and most Americans reflect California, 2 out of 3 supporting civil unions and marriage equality. Remember that civil unions wasn't even in the American language, the American experience in the year 2000. And within about a half a decade, we're having this amazing debate and seeing legislatures pass marriage equality and seeing people in Massachusetts see marriage and realize that the world didn't come to an end. And so I'm sure there's not complete agreement in this room or anywhere about whether this was the right fight. I'm convinced it was, and that it ultimately has changed the landscape of what we're actually fighting for.
Casey, do you just, in looking at the polling on the messaging, and I think there's been some creative thoughts on that, want to share a little bit about some of the messages that seem to be impacting, especially some of the diverse communities we're looking to educate?
Well, let me talk about the message, and thank you so much. The message in general. We've done some polling recently, and sometimes you can really, you can look at polling and get very excited, and then you can look at the next poll and it'll throw you off. But overall, on this issue of marriage, we've seen movement over the last 7 years that normally takes, for most social justice issues, have taken 30 years to achieve just a movement in the polls. And normally over 30 years in an issue involving social justice, that 30-year period means that the people are dying off at the older, more conservative end and coming into the marketplace, the political marketplace at the younger, more liberal end. And it's certainly true that among young people, there's an incredible support for marriage equality. If only young people voted in the numbers they support us, we wouldn't be sitting here today. But they don't, unfortunately. But the movement that we've seen can only be explained by the fact that people have been persuaded to come to our side. And they've been persuaded in a marketplace that has been very antagonistic towards us, especially in the state of California. We actually had a major ballot initiative, which we lost, where people were coming at us in a variety of different ways. And so what we're looking at now is how do we, is there a way to take advantage of the next couple of years in the state of California where, and we know that people are moved when the discussion is about marriage. What if we actually control the discussion? And one of the things we're looking at is creating advertising right now that might go out unanswered into the marketplace. That is, we might be doing advertising at a time when nobody else is coming back at us. If anybody has ever done advertising, that's really the dream situation. Most products are never in that situation. But if you can actually go out and talk to people when nobody else is talking, on the opposite side, you really stand a chance to move them, and we'll look at moving people that way by using that. Another thing that we just discovered in doing some of the research that we have often made the mistake of portraying ourselves as victims of discrimination, and that's reasonable and true, but didn't move people as we found we could move people with a sense of admiration for the courage we exhibit for what we go through in our daily lives. That there was a response among people who are not normally with us on the marriage issue for the idea that we can be in committed relationships, that we can overcome all the difficulties of being married, from paying the mortgages and sending the kids to college and taking out the garbage, to being potential victims of violence or discrimination in the workplace or in the marketplace, and that the public admired that. And that shift of empathy rather than sympathy is something we want to exploit in some of the messaging that we look at. There's an amazingly surprising number to us of people who believe that gays and lesbians can be in long-term committed relationships. I didn't think that was going to show up in the polling. And in California, more than any place that we've looked at around the country, people say they know. I think that I'm not 100% sure in the numbers, but half the people say they know one person who's gay or lesbian, but even larger number, new people, new 3 people who are gay or lesbian. That was not true, obviously, 25 years ago, but it wasn't true 7 or 8 years ago. And I've always argued that familiarity breeds respect. And part of of our coming out process over the years is paying off in that kind of familiarity. I don't want to get into specific advertising ideas, but it's certainly an area that we're going to be looking at. And how do we move? I divide the marketplace up into good people with good ideas, bad people with bad ideas, and good people with bad ideas. And we've got the good people with the good idea. We're never going to get the bad people with the bad ideas. And our job is to move the good people with the bad ideas, and we've seen movement on that already.
We probably have time for about 2 questions. So.
For Mr. Guerrero, do you care to speculate as to whether Governor Schwarzenegger would have signed the marriage equality bill if he were not up for re-election?
Oh, mercy. Yeah. Again, I along with Jeff, there's probably a few other people who did more begging in the window of trying to get this governor to not sign. The one thing I will give him credit for, and I do it reluctantly and don't give him a whole lot of credit for doing it, is that when he ran, when he was asked about this over the course of time, made clear that if a marriage bill came to my desk, I would not sign it unless there was court action and or unless there was a new vote of the people. And you may disagree with that, of course, and I certainly tried to get him to oppose it, to step back, but he has been consistent. And the other part of consistency that I like is that there is an opening, I think, for him to sign it. I'll make a prediction here, and I'm not very good at predictions, but I actually think Governor Schwarzenegger may be the first governor in the country to sign a marriage bill. That is what my gut tells me. I believe the wiggle room that he has created and his staff has created was on purpose. I'm sure, and that's not casting a vote in the next election, because there will be some Democrats I know who will be squarely in favor of marriage equality, and we ought to praise and credit for that. But I am convinced that that there is room, and I actually believe he may be the first governor in the country to do so.
And I would just add, I would think the special election he had, where he was really making a concerted effort to try and somehow drum up turnout on the right, was more important to him than his re-election campaign, as far as the impact it had. But I think that factor was very important to him. Someone else?
I have a question for Mr. Robinson. It's amazing a lot of times when people talk about minority issues that APIs are not included, and to a large extent it's lumped in, that APIs will agree with the kind of the dominant culture. And you were saying that the leadership for the Latinos and Black groups have been on our side. Have you been finding the same thing with that for API leadership? And is there any kind of organized API leadership in California for your queer issues?
Well, it's the danger of being the person of color on the panel. So I will admit a level of ignorance on this, but I would say a couple of things. First, I think the communities are very different, and because our experience of discrimination has been very different, and our experience now of discrimination is very different. So I don't know that a lot of it transfers over, but some of it does, because certainly in our work we work in sort of multi-racial, multi-ethnic organizations and ways. I would say that when it comes to API communities, that's the smallest group. We have the fewest participants at a national level. That's different here in California, of course, because you have a larger population. I don't know, so I'm not as familiar with what's going on specifically in API organizing here in California, other than to say that I know that in fact the groups, the organizing here has been more significant than anywhere else, and that in fact there is leadership that has been, that is emerging. I think that very much that one of the challenges that continues to, for API or political organizing in general has to do with countries of origin, language. All of those issues become extraordinarily challenging when you talk about beginning to do political organizing and sort of who is really being represented. So I think it's an area where there is a great deal of need for improvement, but I would say that I am optimistic because I've seen at least more engagement than I have seen when we've worked in other places.
Yeah, let me just jump in. As we've built this campaign for what is now a non-existent, hopefully non-existent initiative this year, but potentially in the future, we came together with two Asian Pacific Islander communities, one in Southern California and one in Northern California. And I can't speak to how representative they were of the communities, but they seemed to be very representative. And the idea of getting together with them early was the sense that messaging in the API community, the Latino community, and the African American community could actually be the decisive number, could deliver the decisive number of votes on this issue. We didn't, to the best of my knowledge, in the state of California, the number of API voters is the same, the number, as African American voters. So we're not discounting it, and nor do we believe that the message that's going to work for the overall Anglo community will work in that community. And so the answer is yes, we've been organizing it and working with it, and we're not going to ignore it.
And I just wanted to add too, one thing that, that work has really paid off in the marriage equality case. Not only were API groups really a force on the brief that was filed on behalf of a wide range of civil rights groups, but there was also a separate brief that was filed by 29 API groups, specifically just representing that community, that detailed the history of marriage discrimination faced by various API communities here in the state of California. And it was actually just an incredible brief. I would really recommend that folks read it. Very disturbing history, actually, that not everyone here may actually be aware of.
Since Brad's standing up, it means we're coming to an end. So I just want to make one last comment on messaging, which is one of the messages that we haven't discussed is about the economic impact. And one of the things we've seen is the economic impact, both domestic partnership, but especially of marriage equality to the state of California, is enormous. And it's an argument that I think helps us with the governor and with Republicans. And I want to acknowledge the Williams Project for doing that study, because without it, I don't think we would have gotten the AB 205 domestic partnership bill through Gray Davis. It was the fiscal impact that really made a difference with him. So that kind of work that happens is really important, so I want to just acknowledge you guys for that. And just on an optimistic note, a week from Monday, we're doing our first high school LGBT lobby day up in the Capitol. And we already have over 800 LGBT youth coming from around the state to go meet with their legislators and their statewide elected officials. And I think back when I was in high school, I can't even envision anything like that, which was only a couple years ago. And so I thank the panel, for all of you for being here, and thank all of you. Thank you.